Hello, and welcome to our Solidarity workshop on who gets to speak in news coverage, Solidarity reporting on trans issues. My name is Anita Varma, and I lead the Solidarity Journalism Initiative at the Center for Media Engagement here at UT Austin. I am so pleased and grateful to be joined today by my fantastic collaborator, Tuck Woodstock, who is a journalist and educator based in Portland, Oregon. He is the host of the podcast Gender Reveal, and he's a co-founder of Sylveon Consulting and a founding member of the Trans Journalists Association. In addition to that, he is my favorite person to follow on Twitter. So if you do not, I highly encourage you to do so. So again, thank you all for being here. Special thanks to Tuck for joining me in the endeavor of planning this event. And really want to express a lot of gratitude for the time that all of you are taking to be here and to engage. So before we dive in, I just wanted to lay out a few guidelines, norms, rules, whatever you'd like to call these, but expectations about how we can share this space together for the next hour. So as you noticed, I started the recording. I will stop the recording when we get to Q&A so that folks can feel a little more comfortable without being recorded to ask any questions that may be on their minds. With that in mind, you are more than welcome to tweet and reshare and talk about anything you hear from me or from Tuck today. But if you hear something from another participant and you'd like to share it or you'd like to write about it, please just be sure to ask for permission. And if you're not sure how to get in touch with the person who said it, you can absolutely ask me at any point, and I'd be happy to connect you. So that's point one. The second point is that, of course, the fact that you're here means that you are very likely very aware of how important our topic is for today around representation of trans issues and continued attacks on trans people. With that in mind, I really need everyone to keep in mind the pain attached to a lot of the questions that can come up and to keep everything respectful. So to be mindful that we're all coming at this from different places, but that we're certainly not here to deny anyone's experience, and want to make sure that we're walking the walk of solidarity as we talk about it as well. So again, thank you all for being here. You are welcome to turn on your videos. You're welcome to leave them off as well, however you're most comfortable. And I'm really glad that we could all come together and share this space. So to start things off, I will share a little more about what brings me here and how this workshop came to be, and some reflections on some underlying tension involved in the fact that I am a cisgender person who is here talking about coverage of trans issues. And this might be relevant to others of us in the room as well. And then I'll talk a bit more about what solidarity means and how it can help improve reporting on trans issues. After that, I'm going to share an example that came up just in the last week or so that I think is a really phenomenal example of how solidarity reporting can help improve the accuracy and the substance of coverage of trans issues. And then I'll turn it over to Tuck. We'll share some resources after Tuck speaks, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So let's get started. So as I said, I wanted to start off by naming a tension that comes up in a lot of solidarity work, and particularly in this conversation around who is leading, who is speaking, and how these conversations may unfold. Second, I want to get into what I mentioned around what solidarity means and what it doesn't mean. Solidarity is often used in some overbroad senses that can dilute its meaning or make it kind of distorted compared to a more substantive definition. And finally, we'll get into what solidarity reporting means and how it can help improve reporting on trans issues. So let's start with the tension. Cisgender people, myself included, are in larger numbers than previously leading workshops on coverage of trans issues. So why is this happening? Well, for starters, there's privilege attached, right? For cis people as members of the majority group, there's a sense that, there's an onlooker and observer ability to see the forest for the trees, to stand outside of the issue, and therefore somehow that is translating into a presumption of being able to speak and lead. The second reason has to do with resources, has to do with having grants and institutional affiliations, titles that may give cis people platforms that are in proportion not the same amount available for people who are trans. Now, to be clear, you can have privilege without having many resources. You can also have resources without having much privilege. So that's why I separate these two out, though of course we also know that these often go hand in hand. And finally, as we all probably know, there's been a really big increase in attention to trans issues, particularly in national news coverage, as news on proposed legislation has grown, right? So why is this problematic? Well, cisgender people, even while claiming to be in solidarity with trans people, run the risk of speaking over or excluding or further marginalizing or maybe tokenizing trans people, right? This is the deeper rooted concern with any claims of being in solidarity. At what point is it solidarity versus trying to speak on behalf of people who obviously can speak for themselves? So let's take this a little bit deeper. And I go into this not because I think the cisgender people in this room may be planning their own workshops very soon, but because I think it's also relevant to our discussion and understanding of what solidarity looks like and what those actions may bring with them. So let's think about some of the positive sides of cisgender people leading workshops on covering trans issues. So you probably heard this many times: silence is complicity. Staying silent in the face of injustice is as bad as supporting it yourself, right? So cisgender people need to speak up in support. That stands to reason. But then we also should think about the con of that. We might articulate it like this: we as cisgender people and people in general often don't know what we don't know. So in this case, we know that cisgender people are not living this issue the way that trans people are. Right? And that lack of understanding is in some ways inherent due to differences in lived experience, but cisgender people may not always know what questions we aren't asking and should have come in with a better understanding of. But let's go back to some of the pros. Members of the majority have a responsibility to stand with minorities under attack. This is often the logic of any kind of solidarity work, to say if you are a member of the majority and you are not under attack, then it's really not okay to say, hey, some of my fellow members of the majority are attacking a minority group, so I'm just going to walk away, hope they sort it out for themselves, right? So that would be a reason to push against and would be in our pro column. The downside, though, is the cis savior complex. I did not come up with this term, but I think it is deeply applicable. Cisgender people, even while claiming to be in solidarity, may center themselves and say, well, I'm in this position of privilege. I can see the bigger picture because I'm not personally tied to it. And therefore, I know the answers, right? This is problematic. One final pro, and this again does not solely come up for folks in these settings, but across settings where some people have privilege and power, but to say that we need to leverage our power to be allies, to not just be allies in name only, but to be allies in our actions. Now, that level of action is really important because very quickly claims of being in solidarity can deteriorate into what's called armchair activism, where cisgender people may benefit from talking about supporting marginalized people, trans people, without actually taking action, particularly when action may put their privilege at some kind of risk. So as you can tell, this list of pros and cons, I'm not at all suggesting that, well, there's 3 of each, so we balanced out. You know, it's not that. It's that there's a tension attached to any kind of solidarity work, including this conversation. So here are a few ideas on addressing this tension. And I really want to be clear that these ideas do not resolve this tension. If any of us are under the impression that we can resolve that tension, we've lost the plot, right? There is going to be this tension in solidarity work when people who are outside of the group directly impacted and attacked are speaking and trying to join a cause. So one answer is, or one approach is to collaborate with groups like the Trans Journalists Association that I am so grateful to for collaborating with me on this discussion. The second is to pay trans people for their time and contributions. This may be in the form of bylines, sharing bylines, referring people in to take the byline, and also compensating speakers, compensating panelists, compensating collaborators. Third is joining workshops, events, discussions, days of action led by trans people. Instead of having cisgender people say, well, here's the action we need to take, let's follow instead, right? And you'll hear some more about some opportunities to do so later today. And finally, and this is where my work on solidarity reporting comes in, is centering trans people's perspectives, right? Centering those perspectives. So that's our segue into what solidarity means and doesn't mean. And those of you who have come to solidarity workshops before will not be surprised to hear my definition of solidarity, which is a commitment to social justice that translates into action. Now, action is not just a private belief. It's not a personal feeling that we would never say out loud. It's also not just a promise, right? We hear promises to do better. In solidarity, I promise in the future, I will operate differently. But that's not yet action, right? Action means doing something out in the world that's in public, right? It's not in secret. And social justice means quite simply dignity for everyone in a society based not on external qualifications or validation from people with power who say, yes, I agree, that over there, that is a person, but instead based on inherent worth. All of us as people have inherent worth, and the other name for that is dignity. Now here comes that tension again. Solidarity is horizontal. It is not top-down charity. So charity is where we might say, hey, folks with some means, please peel off a piece, just a piece, and give it to folks who don't have as many resources, right? Our expectation with charity is that doing that does not mean that that person loses their standing wherever they were in the social hierarchy. If they're engaging in charity, it's very likely that they have diminished their standing in some way. And on the contrary, they may improve their standing by engaging in charity. In contrast with solidarity, power goes to the collective. It's not at the top of a hierarchy or near the top of a hierarchy. So what does this mean? It means that solidarity requires power sharing. We cannot be in solidarity if we're hoarding power, right? So if an action is going to lead to you maintaining your power or even getting more of it, that would not be solidarity. If it's about sharing across, right, with that collective, then we're getting closer to solidarity. So what does this mean for journalism? Well, solidarity reporting is still a commitment to social justice that translates into action, but that action is reporting. Now, of course, we all know, I'm sure, that not all reporting on trans issues or social injustice writ large is aligned with respecting people's inherent dignity. So let's get a little more specific about what solidarity reporting entails. So number one is deciding what's newsworthy, where the stakes of human dignity are where journalists reporting in solidarity would spring into action. This is different than saying that journalists will spring into action if a governor makes a statement, if a celebrity makes a statement, if someone has died, right? Those are different news values than recognizing the stakes of human dignity that may be ongoing. It's very likely that this is not a temporal, a momentary or an event-based issue, but that it's an ongoing problem. So how do we know when people's dignity is at stake? Well, there are lots of ways, but some of the most explicit ways are these. So first is if we see that a group of people's existence is being criminalized, that for a group to exist, there are lawmakers attempting to make that a crime, to claim that that is not okay. The second is when, instead of a crime, or sometimes coinciding with criminalizing, that the existence of a group is being denied altogether, right? That is very much at odds with respecting people's inherent worth. And finally, silencing a group of people in discourse about themselves is also an act that does not respect people's inherent dignity. So who gets to speak in solidarity reporting, and what do they get to speak about? Well, this is where solidarity reporting differs from a lot of the dominant reporting modes that we've seen in the United States for quite some time. And that's because in solidarity reporting, people with lived experience and expertise get to speak and be heard, not solely officials, celebrities, or people with elite titles. Now, let's be clear. You can have lived experience and also have expertise, right? That one does not preclude the other. But with solidarity reporting, we would say that having lived experience of an issue really qualifies you to know quite a lot more with greater insight than someone who has only stood outside of it. And what do sources get to speak about? Well, in solidarity reporting, sources would be speaking about their perspectives and not only their pain. This means that journalists are asking and making space for, and then actually including, an answer to the question, what do you think? As opposed to only asking, how do you feel, right? So the question, how do you feel, is certainly a reasonable one to ask, but when that's the only question that people who experience marginalization are being asked, that basically means they're being placed in a box, right? Where they can express emotion, and likely these are negative emotions that journalists are expecting to hear about, but not their views on what is actually going on and what needs to change. So the sum total with solidarity reporting is that it ends up being more accurate, not only in coverage of trans issues, but in coverage of a range of social injustices, where again and again, we see that officials, celebrities, and elites are often quite comfortable and able to amplify misinformation through news coverage, right? Through standard reporting routines. With solidarity reporting, it becomes like a grounded fact check that prevents a lot of that misinformation from gaining so much traction. Because instead of relying on people who may not know or may claim to know things that are untrue, we're focusing and representing people who know because they've lived it. So let me show you an example of this that, as I mentioned, came out quite recently. And I think it's such a phenomenal example, both of the approach and of the logic behind it. So Dilena Miller wrote this piece for WUSF, and it's called "These Trans Youths Say Florida's So-Called Don't Say Gay Bill Puts Them at Risk." And you'll have access to these slides and to the link. I really encourage you to take a look at the article, because I think that Dilena has done such a phenomenal job here of ensuring that there's representation not of just one person or teenager specifically who may be affected, but at a range, at a community level response, and also showing us the variation in the different ways that people respond and think about this bill and what it means. So that's where we have perspectives with a plural S there, right? So this is just a very short selection, but I think it's really valuable to see what kinds of quotes get included and represented in solidarity reporting. So we hear from a therapist who is a trans person named Ostrow, who says the social discourse about their worthiness to exist is really at the heart of this bill. We thrive in connection, we thrive in community, and these bills disrupt, and it's very, very intentional, right? The second quote picks up on this term intentional. It's an intentional vagueness about age-appropriate conversations, which leads to just the general stereotype of queerness being sexually deviant and dangerous to youth, which is completely untrue, and leads many people to just hate themselves. Who are we hearing from? Is this an analyst? Is this a cisgender person who has studied teenagers for however many years? No, it is an actual teenager, specifically Rain Weinstein, a transgender 18-year-old senior at a high school that will be affected by this bill. And finally, we hear from one of Rain's classmates, Sage Ackerman, who says, my friends and the queer youth that I know are still finding out their identity, and just being in an environment where they know that the government does not see them as valid is just like a hard environment to grow up in. So hopefully you're seeing as well that by including people's perspectives, it doesn't mean that they're somehow flattened out into not expressing the fullness of their humanity, but instead that they get to express that, they get to express their genuine, authentic struggles, as well as their thoughts, their views on what are the stakes here and how and why do they need to change. So with that, I will turn things over to Tuck, who will tell us much more about how we can think about approaching this kind of coverage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anita. Yes, I will share my slides now. And of course, it is trying to fight with me, but here we go. Okay, so happy Trans Day of Visibility to everyone. I am so happy that we could do this today, the only day in which I am perceivable. What incredible luck that we are having on this day. So my name is Tuck Woodstock. I'm the host of the podcast Gender Reveal, which is a podcast made by and about trans people. If you'd like to check it out. I also co-founded Sylveon Consulting, which is a firm that provides workshops for journalists and other organizations to dig into the topics we're talking about today, but in much more detail and much more depth, much more specificity. And then also I'm a co-founder of the Trans Journalists Association. As Anita mentioned, there were many of those. It was and is a very collaborative project. There are more than 500 members of the Trans Journalists Association right now. And so if you are looking for trans journalists, there are just simply so many of us, and virtually every single one is underemployed. So today, because we only have not very much time for me to speak, this is a topic that I normally talk about for at least 3 hours when I'm covering it in a workshop, and I'm going to do like 15-20 minutes today. And so because of that, I just want to focus on talking about the distinction between trans issues, trans people, and trans inclusion, and how we as solidarity reporters, solidarity editors, solidarity administrators can think about bringing all of these things into our newsrooms. So starting with trans issues is a specific beat. So like any other beat, we want people who are covering trans issues to have subject knowledge, to have context about what's going on locally and nationally and internationally on this beat, depending on what type of publication you're working with, to have sources, to develop relationships with your sources so that they trust you and that when something happens, you know who to go and who to talk to, and you know that they'll talk to you. The trans issues beat intersects with so many other beats: healthcare, sports, homelessness, politics, education, parenting, on and on and on and on. And so also people who cover like trans issues will normally have a specialty within that. So like Frankie De La Creta is, I think, the most prominent like trans sports reporter specifically. And I can give you a bunch of other examples there too. But just because someone has covered a trans issue doesn't mean they're qualified for all trans issues. Sometimes people try to hire me to talk about kids, and I'm like, I like specifically how to have kids. I'm like, that's actually a role for a therapist, which is not me at all. So I would want to find a separate source that is a therapist or a teacher who works with children. If so you are not on this beat and you're asked to cover this beat, I need people to be aware that it is a beat and it requires subject knowledge. So if you don't have that subject knowledge, it is very easy to make mistakes or to just tell a story that's already been told hundreds of times because it feels new to you because you haven't written that story before. So what happens that we see a lot is cis people writing a profile that basically just means, hey, did you know that trans people exist? And it's like, yes, we do. We do know, we have heard. And just because you have not written that story before and you're just learning for the first time that trans people exist doesn't mean that we actually need that story in the world, just because it's already been written so many times. And we want our newsletter, or not our newsletters, we want our newsrooms, but also our newsletters to be really like pushing for innovative new stories that are bringing new things to our audiences and challenging our audience in new ways. And so if you're put on this beat and you don't have this research, context, subject knowledge, I would suggest partnering with someone who has been on this beat previously, specifically probably a trans journalist, to work on this. And that's not to say that every trans journalist is on the trans beat. That's not true, but I didn't have a lot of space on this slide. So when I say trans journalist, I mean someone who is probably trans, who has worked in this beat for a long time and knows how to work on it. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that we do this correctly and that we take a lot of attention to getting this right? in the chat, this is the only time I'm going to make you like engage with me, but in this chat, I would like you to guess two numbers, you put a slash between them, the percentage of Americans who don't know a trans person and the percentage of Americans who don't think that it's possible to be trans. So I want you to guess these two numbers. Americans who don't know a trans person, her, them, and Americans who think that trans people don't exist. Two numbers. Someone has to put something in the chat. I'm just going to drink this kombucha until you do. Okay, 85 and 70, 90. 40 and 50. 40, 50 is 30, 30. We've got a huge spread. I love this. Thank you for playing this game with me. I really appreciate it. Incredible. Okay, so this 50-50 person is close, but you're all, you know, some of you are in range. So about 60% of people don't think they know a trans person, which is actually down from 84 a few years ago. And about 50% of people, 50 to 60% of people don't think that it's possible to be trans. I love this stat because it's very correlation is not causation. Wouldn't it be funny if those were exactly the same people? I don't think they are, but the point is that most people don't think they know a trans person. And so because of that, the place they're getting their information about trans people is the media. There is a general public lack of information about trans people and also of personal experience with trans people. And there is actually a statistical correlation between people who have met a trans person and people who think trans people exist and people who think trans people deserve rights. And not extra rights, just the ones that we all get, you know? So because of not just the general lack of information, but also vocal misinformation efforts by politicians and other high profile people, authors of children's wizarding books, and also because of the catastrophic effects that these political efforts have had and are having nationally and beyond right now, it is the media's responsibility to provide accurate and nuanced information about these issues. So if we're getting this wrong or we're repeating misinformation that those politicians and other high profile people are giving, or we're just like not pushing the envelope in any way because we don't know what we should be bringing to this story, we're letting down these people, and we're letting down trans people, not because we need to be some sort of like crusader for trans rights, but because trans people deserve to be spoken about at least accurately. Like, I'm just asking for accuracy. So we talked about trans issues, and we said that that is specifically a beat. Trans people are a type of person that exists in the world. They might be in any story at any time. You know, they can be a source, they can be an expert source, they can be a subject of your piece. Because of that, everyone in the newsroom needs to have a basic concept of how to talk about trans people in a way that isn't completely unhinged. So I am going to take a few minutes to talk about that. And it's specifically the number one mistake that I see. Because if there was one thing I can give you today, I want to give you examples of this number one mistake that I think is not only so common, but also so easy to fix. A lot of stuff that I talk about in my trainings are like how to re-examine your own concept of gender and like restructure those neural pathways in your head. And this is just like a style guide tip. So I figured it was easy to offer you in like 5 minutes. And many of you are going to be already familiar with it. So the explanatory comma, for those of you who are not familiar, it is a pair of commas that, in an aside, gives you an explanation of the noun you are saying. So if I just said Ruby is asleep, people would be like, who? But if I said Ruby, the most beautiful cat in the world, is asleep, and you're like, oh yes, Ruby is clearly Tuck's cat who is asleep, like right here off screen. So explanatory commas indicate to our readers what is assumed knowledge versus what is niche knowledge. It is niche knowledge to know who Ruby is, Ruby, the most beautiful cat in the world. But if you subscribe to the Gender Reveal newsletter, it is actually assumed knowledge that you know who Ruby is because she's in the newsletter every week. So I would just say Ruby's asleep. So this is making clear who our intended audience is and what is or is not expected of them, right? So there's a really long example from Sam Sanders from the Gender Reveal podcast, because we interviewed Sam Sanders, a cis person, for some reason. And this is another example about how when NPR would talk about Jay-Z, they would explanatory comma Jay-Z. They would also explanatory comma hip hop music, but they wouldn't explanatory comma bluegrass. And so it sent this signal to Sam Sanders that they didn't expect their audience to know who Jay-Z was, but they did expect them to know about bluegrass, and thus that their audience was white, right? Of course. And so we're sending these kind of implicit signals all of the time in our reporting of who this is for and what we expect them to know. So what this looks like in trans people is this New York Times article that was about a stabbing at the MOMA. So this is about a cisgender man, for all we know, who stabbed someone at a museum. And the reporter took time out of the story to say Joe Walker, 24, a graduate student at Yale University who uses the pronouns they and them, was in a second floor cafe when the incident occurred. We did not have to stop the story about a stabbing in a museum to say who uses the pronouns they and them. We could just say Joe Walker, a graduate student at Yale University, was in a second floor cafe. They left through the emergency exit. We had no idea what was going on. They said, that's demonstrating that they use the pronouns they and them. If you are like, what will my readers do if they were confused? So two things. One is, again, we need to indicate to our readers what is assumed knowledge. And in the year of our Lord, 2022, we just need to expect that people have heard of they, them pronouns. And if they haven't, they need to learn it the same way that we also didn't explain what Yale University was. But if people didn't know that, they could Google that, right? And so we just need to make sure that people are being challenged to understand the story. And if we're writing sentences that are confusing with a singular they, then we need to write better sentences because I hear all the time a they, them pronoun would be too confusing, but I never hear, a she, her pronoun is too confusing, so we can't use pronouns. If the pronoun is going to be confusing, we write a better sentence. We're writers, that is our job. And so they, them pronouns, we just use them. We don't say who uses the pronouns in a completely unrelated story. This is one that's not egregious, but it just popped up yesterday, so I put it in while I was making the slideshow. It's about a story about CODA and what deaf people think about CODA. And it says Layla Holcomb, this place this year is deaf and non-binary, and so the deaf experience can be complicated. Being non-binary, I read the whole article, has nothing to do with this person's perspective, other than that happens to be who they are, but it could easily have been like, is deaf and left-handed, for all the difference it made in the article. But this person, and I actually would suspect their editor, felt like it was important to name that this person is non-binary. But the other sources didn't say like, Joe Smith, comma, who is deaf and a man, comma, kept going. So like we're only pointing out when people are non-binary and trans. And again, that sends the signal that there's something weird and like alien about trans people, that we need to name that they're trans. And every time we talk about them, and we really don't, we only need to name it when it's relevant. Another thing that goes with the commas, although there's not always commas in them, is saying that LGBTQ people identify as the things that they are. So people all the time will say Demi Lovato identifies as non-binary and uses they, them pronouns, or Jill was born male but started identifying as a trans woman. But we don't do that with other people, and we don't do that with other titles. So we don't say, or descriptors. So we don't say Will Smith identifies as a man and uses he, him pronouns. We also don't say Joe Biden identifies as a man using his pronouns. And we don't say Joe Biden identifies as the president, because Joe Biden is just the president. And the fact that he identifies it is implied by the fact that he is the president. So again, when we're talking about queer and trans people, those are the identities that people tend to use the word identifies with. And we can just say that they are those things. Demi Lovato is non-binary. Jill, whoever Jill is, who I made up, is a woman. And this is another thing that we see all the time to make reporting treat trans people like aliens. So in my little 10 minutes here, really what I'm doing is begging you to talk to trans people like they're normal people, and to stop doing extra linguistic flourishes to make them sound special and different, because we're really just people. And I would love to be spoken about as just a person, just some guy. This is my favorite identifies as example. It's long, but this is a caption. There's a photo of a bunch of comics here that's cut off. Some of the comedians featured in the story doing stand-up and performing on stage and screen over the years. From left, Joel Kim Booster, Cola Scola, who identifies as non-binary, Jabuki Young White, Matt Rogers, and Escola. What just happened? What was that? Why did that happen? There's no reason for that. Why would we do that? Just write the caption. Please just be normal. Okay, so we talked about trans issues and trans people. And now we're going to talk about trans inclusion real specifically. We're going to talk about one type of trans inclusion, which is writing a story in the way that creates spaces for trans and queer people to exist. Like trans people, this can be relevant to any story. And the reason it's important is not just because we like trans people to feel like they're people, although we also like that, but because it actually makes our writing more accurate and it makes it less lazy. And so when we're writing something about abortion, for example, and I know this is a contentious one, but when writing something about abortion, I pulled these two little graphs from one from the New York Times and one from a LGBTQ publication called Them. And they're talking about the same thing, and they're published within 24 hours of each other. But in the New York Times, they're talking about the pregnancy, 6-week pregnancy. It says, this is very early in a pregnancy, and many women do not know that they're pregnant at that point. By the time a pregnant woman misses her period, she is 4 weeks pregnant. Then a woman would have to wait about 2 weeks to recognize her condition, confirm the pregnancy, make a decision. Many women might not track their periods carefully. So that was 7 genders. We put 7 genders in these 3 paragraphs. Them.us is conveying basically the same information. They're just not putting a gender in it. And it's not reading weird. They're not saying anything like especially long and wild to dance around it. Like they're not using some kind of like people who are pregnant or may become pregnant or identify as people who may become pregnant. They're just saying, I have to move my window. The law prohibits nearly all abortion in the state by banning it after 6 weeks of pregnancy before most people know who are pregnant or know that they are pregnant. According to abortion advocates, 85% of abortions in Texas occur when the patient is at least 6 weeks pregnant. So not anything wild. They are just using gender neutral language. There's actually a fight happening on Twitter right now because the Washington Post said pregnant people, and like 5 conservatives with really big Twitter followings are very upset about it. But I would argue that it is the correct thing to do. This is an example of someone doing this very well. Rebecca Ellis at OPB has written a series of articles about the way that trans people, or the way that people experience being tear gassed. And she has always integrated trans people into it. And I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. I'm just letting you look at it while I talk. But the things that she does is she integrates trans sources into her stories about the way that tear gas affects menstruation. And she does it in a way that doesn't draw a lot of special extra attention to the trans people or make the trans people seem like aliens, but she also does include them just as part of a story. This graphic also that was from Kaiser Permanente is talking about changes in menstrual health, but the body is not like super feminine, and it doesn't say like women changes in women's health, you know, like it's just a gender neutral graph or chart and a gender neutral document that also brings trans voices into it. And this series was actually a collaboration that I did with Rebecca. And so our partnership included me when she said that the story was going to exist, saying, hey, did you know that this is happening to trans people? Because Rebecca says, and then me saying, hey, I would love to help you find sources because people know me as a public trans figure. And also I just happen to know a lot of trans people that have been tear gassed other than me. And so I can reach out to some other people and tell them that you are a trustworthy source, which is really, really important because trans people are treated terribly in the media. And so when one of us gets a press request, we literally all like text each other and say, hey, can I trust this person? Like that is a very common thing that happens, or this outlet, right? So that was something that I could do. And then I also was paid by Oregon Public Broadcasting to look at a draft of the first story that she did to make sure that like we all felt good about the trans inclusion in the story. And then once I did that with the first story in the series, I could just hand it to her and she just took it the rest of the series and she did amazing. And I don't think any trans people looked at it and she did incredible. So I don't want to say only trans people can do these stories, but it is helpful to bring trans people in at some point to help you get the ball rolling into this subject expertise. I think that's everything. Nope, one more slide. Trans inclusion can also mean treating trans journalists like journalists. So we're not just treating trans people like people, but we're treating trans journalists like actual journalists because we are. And that means hiring us, not just to tell trans stories, but also to tell trans stories. And also to listen to us when we raise issues or give feedback. So there's an issue going on with 2 of my friends who work in a national publication right now. And that national publication put out a factually inaccurate story about trans youth, and they are asking to get it corrected. And they have been told that it will hurt the reporter's feelings if it's corrected, which is not how we handle journalism normally, but is apparently what happens when trans people ask that something is corrected because it is currently spreading misinformation about trans people. So just listening to trans people when we say, hey, this is actually an issue and we need it to be corrected. And that's true, obviously, of all marginalized people. And then lastly, trans inclusion can also mean investing actual time and resources in the type of training that we're doing right now. It is extremely cool that you all are here and have taken an hour out of your day to do this. But the work that I do typically is not free. It costs money because it is my job. And also, like I said, is typically more of like a 3-hour thing instead of like a 15-minute thing. And I think that bringing someone like that, not necessarily me, but someone like that into your newsrooms, or taking the time to learn and investing actual resources in this as a newsroom, is really important. Not because like, oh, it's sensitivity, or like we're like checking the box that we like did DEI and now we're good. But because again, this makes your reporting more accurate, more nuanced, and more innovative. And we want to be doing those things in general. And I just think that it completely boggles my mind that people who are really serious journalists, who really care a lot about their craft, do not care about whether they're getting these things correct, you know? And so I just want to make sure that everyone knows that there are these opportunities for them to learn about how to write about these things in a way that is more accurate and more nuanced and more innovative. And so if you want to talk about that later, I'm happy to do that. But right now I am going to turn it back over to Anita to share a few things.
Thank you so much, Tuck. So now I would like to play a short imagination game called Let's Say We've Convinced You. Let's say we've convinced you that solidarity reporting is a good idea, that developing and enriching our understanding of how certain constructions and terminology are not going in the direction of accurate reporting, and that this conversation really ought to be more than an hour. Let's share some resources aligned with that assumption that we're imagining that we have convinced you so thoroughly of all of these things. So first off, we have what's called a solidarity reporting guide, which I'm just about to drop in the chat and I'll share with you now. And in this guide, we published it at the end of last year in November, and hopefully you're all seeing that with our notebook and guide on top. But basically it takes you through a little more in depth with some links as well about what the full process of solidarity reporting looks like. So I touched on it very briefly, but really we have 5 phases of it: newsworthiness, source selection, interviewing, framing and word choice, as well as considering impact. And this takes you through not only for you to hopefully be able to learn more about it, but also for your colleagues. If you are aware of other folks in your networks who may find this useful and interesting and generative for how to go about, you know, doing stories that we're often habituated into doing one kind of way based on a press conference, based on a press release, but taking it deeper, right? How can we do that? And in what direction do we take that? So this is one resource freely available to you on the same site. We also have some additional resources related to other examples of solidarity journalism. I showed you one, there are many, many more, and some FAQs. Let me also share with you, and hopefully this switches when I click. Are you all seeing now the Trans Journalists Association style guide? Yes, awesome. Tuck, could you say a little bit about this resource?
Yes, absolutely. So the style guide was made collaboratively by a organization of trans journalists. This is one of the founding projects of the Trans Journalists Association. It is currently being revamped, and so it is very much like a living document. And because the way that we think and talk about gender and trans people in this society is changing so rapidly, I don't want to say that this is like 100% perfect for every situation, but it is a very strong starting point for folks who are looking for just concepts, both in terms of like, again, like it says on the screen, terms and phrases to avoid, glossary of terms, but then also just style tips on making your reporting better, which is something like all of this that I really appreciate. And so it's worth actually reading through that section, which I know we don't normally say like just read a style guide, but it's short, and I do encourage people to look through it to get a concept of what to do. And then also I'll say that in addition to this, SPJ has like a free hotline about race and gender. So if you have a question that you need answered quickly, folks from TGA, folks from, I always get the acronym wrong, the gay and lesbian, NGLJA. Yes, and some other places also staff that line as well. And so that's a nice like urgent companion to the style guide that's more if you like have time to peruse it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And last but not least, Tuck, could you tell us a little bit more about the longer opportunity that you were alluding to?
Yes, sorry, I don't know. I didn't realize I turned my video off immediately. Yes, absolutely. And I put all of my websites on a screen. So let me see if I can share this again. But I am teaching a 2-part 4-hour workshop on this topic. Yeah, there we go. That starts later next month, I guess. It's the 31st. So beyond pronouns, accurate nuanced gender reporting. It's on April 13th and 20th from 2 to 4 p.m. And then there will be like future iterations of this as well. Hopefully, it does cost money. There is a sliding scale option for people who are paying out of their own pocket. And you can sign up at gender4journos@bpt.me. There's like links all over Twitter and other things as well. And then here are my other links. Also, Sylveon is a consulting company, so that's who I'm teaching this public workshop for. But also, if you're in a newsroom and you would like the whole newsroom to learn something, I would love to talk to just your newsroom. I do that all the time, so you can reach out through that. Gender Podcast is the podcast that I make. This is my website, and then Anita mentioned Twitter, and so I was like, I will add that, but I wouldn't recommend it, but you can do it. So yes, I'm really excited about this workshop. It goes into a lot of details of stuff that I had no time to talk about today, or stuff that I just scratched the surface on, and just like really dig in, answer questions, like workshop specific issues that have come up in newsrooms, think about different story tropes that often come up in stories about trans people and how we can avoid them, going into more stylistic things like the things I talked about today with explanatory commas and identifies as, but in more detail as well. And also just really examining again how we're thinking about gender and the ways that we can challenge that just as a person in our lives. And so it's not just for report. I mean, it is specifically a lot of reporter specific information, but there's also just like a being a human in the world information in there as well. So I'm really excited about that, and people are welcome to attempt. And that is that.
Excellent.
Now,
thank you.
Question time. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Tuck. And really want to encourage everyone who feels it that we've scratched the surface here, but they would like to go deeper to consider registering and joining Tuck for that great set of events. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording so we can get into some Q&A during our remaining time together.